The convoy of white vehicles emerged from the pre-dawn mist like ghosts materializing from another world. Captain Samuel Moussa adjusted his night vision goggles and counted again. 23 vehicles bearing the unmistakable blue and white markings of the United Nations. The digital clock on his command post read 3:47 a.m. Something felt wrong. Moussa had been stationed at the Koudougou border crossing for 8 years, long enough to develop an instinct for danger that had kept him alive through 3 attempted coup attempts and countless smuggling operations. This convoy, appearing at an unusual hour on an uncommon route, triggered every alarm bell in his experienced mind. The lead vehicle approached the checkpoint, its headlights cutting through the darkness of the Sahel. Behind the wheel sat a man whose bearing screamed military despite his civilian clothes. Straight posture, alert eyes scanning for threats, hands positioned for quick action. The passenger, a tall European with graying temples, held himself with the arrogance Moussa had learned to recognize in foreign operatives. "Papers," Moussa requested in French. His rifle visible but not threatening, the passenger, who introduced himself as Colonel Marcus Vandenberg, presented a leather folder containing what appeared to be legitimate UN documentation. The seals looked authentic, the signatures properly placed, the photographs matching the faces before him. But the thermal imaging display on Moussa's portable scanner told a different story. "Your manifest indicates 47 aid workers," Moussa said carefully. "My equipment shows over 300 heat signatures." Vandenberg's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around the eyes that betrayed years of military training. "These vehicles contain sensitive medical equipment that generates heat signatures. Your scanner is picking up thermal variations from our refrigeration units and electronic equipment." It was a reasonable explanation. It might have satisfied a less experienced border guard. But Moussa had specific intelligence from the capital. Unusual movement detected along the northern frontier. Chatter intercepted suggesting a major operation targeting the nation's stability. President Ibrahim Traoré had implemented new protocols 6 months earlier, requiring thorough inspection of all international vehicles regardless of their claimed diplomatic status. "I'll need to conduct a physical inspection," Moussa announced. Vandenberg's mask slipped entirely. "These vehicles are under UN protection. You have no authority to search them. I demand to speak to your superiors immediately." The tone, condescending, dismissive, entitled, was one Moussa had encountered countless times from foreigners who believed African borders were mere suggestions rather than sovereign boundaries. But tonight, with intelligence warnings echoing in his mind and his thermal scanner showing impossible heat signatures, Moussa wasn't backing down. "Sir, I have specific orders from the Presidential Guard. All vehicles, regardless of their claimed status, are subject to inspection when national security concerns are present." What Captain Moussa didn't know was that this convoy had been tracked for 3 weeks by intelligence services, operating under President Traoré's direct command. The operation, codenamed Sahel Spring by its planners, represented the most sophisticated attempt to destabilize the nation since independence. The planning had begun 4 months earlier in a glass conference room 30 floors above Geneva's financial district. Around the polished table sat representatives from mining conglomerates, defense contractors, and private military companies. The meeting was disguised as a humanitarian planning session, complete with PowerPoint presentations about refugee assistance and medical aid delivery. Marcus Vandenberg, the operation's military commander, had overseen similar missions in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. His reputation for successful regime change operations had made him the natural choice for what the planners called the African problem. The problem, as they saw it, was President Traoré's resource nationalism, his insistence on transparent bidding processes for mineral rights, fair revenue sharing with local communities, and environmental protections that reduced profit margins. Traditional methods of persuasion had failed. Bribery attempts were publicly exposed and the officials involved prosecuted. Economic pressure was absorbed through new partnerships with non-Western nations. Military threats were met with alliance building and defensive preparations. The consortium funding the operation had decided on direct action. 260 mercenaries, recruited from elite special forces units across 3 continents, would enter the country disguised as humanitarian workers. Once inside, they would execute a coordinated assault on government buildings, military installations, and communication infrastructure. The chaos would be blamed on terrorist groups, justifying international intervention that would effectively end the nation's sovereignty. The mercenaries weren't cheap soldiers of fortune, but highly trained operatives. Each promised $1 million for successful completion of the mission. The operation's total budget exceeded $300 million, a significant investment that the mining companies considered worthwhile given the projected returns from unrestricted resource extraction. Captain Moussa, standing at his checkpoint with growing suspicion, represented the only obstacle between this carefully planned operation and its execution. Moussa keyed his satellite radio, connecting directly to the regional command post. Within minutes, the call had been escalated to President Traoré himself. The president's response was immediate and unequivocal. Search every vehicle. Document everything. If they resist, arrest them all. As Moussa's team began approaching the convoy with inspection equipment, Vandenberg's protests grew increasingly desperate. He placed calls to various UN offices, threatening international incidents and war crimes tribunals. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to intimidating African officials into compliance. But these weren't the corrupt, easily intimidated officials Vandenberg had dealt with in previous operations. These were soldiers serving under a president who had built his reputation on anti-corruption efforts and sovereignty defense. They followed their orders without hesitation or fear. The first vehicle appeared normal. Medical supplies clearly labeled and properly documented, exactly what would be expected in a humanitarian convoy. The second contained food aid, bags of rice, flour, and canned goods stacked to the ceiling. Everything seemed legitimate until Sergeant Ibrahim Cohn, Moussa's most experienced inspector, noticed something odd about the third truck's cargo bay. "Captain?" Cohn called out, his voice tight with tension. "You need to see this." Behind what appeared to be a solid wall of aid boxes, Cohn had discovered a hidden compartment. Inside were assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, explosive devices, night vision equipment, and sophisticated communication gear. This wasn't humanitarian aid. It was an invasion force. Moussa immediately ordered all vehicles searched thoroughly. Each truck revealed its deadly secrets: satellite communication systems capable of jamming government frequencies, detailed maps of the capital with government buildings circled in red, target lists containing names of officials to be eliminated, and propaganda materials prepared to claim terrorist responsibility for planned attacks. The scale of the deception became clear as more vehicles were inspected. This wasn't a rogue operation, but a carefully orchestrated military campaign designed to overthrow a sovereign government. The mercenaries, realizing their cover was blown, faced a critical decision. They could surrender and face prosecution, or they could attempt to fight their way out. Several, apparently believing their superior training and equipment would prevail against poorly trained African forces, chose violence. The first shot came from Derek Kruger, a South African mercenary whose resume included operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and 3 African nations. His bullet struck a border guard in the shoulder, and suddenly the pre-dawn quiet erupted into chaos. What followed was a brief but intense firefight that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. The mercenaries, despite their training and superior equipment, found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. They were trapped in vehicles, surrounded and outnumbered by defenders fighting for their homeland. Captain Moussa's forces, though outgunned, demonstrated remarkable discipline and tactical awareness. They used the convoy's confined positions against the mercenaries, employing suppressing fire and coordinated movement to minimize their own casualties while systematically neutralizing the threat. The firefight lasted only 12 minutes but felt like hours to those involved. When the shooting stopped, 7 mercenaries were dead, 12 wounded, and the rest had surrendered. Among the captured was someone whose presence elevated the incident from a mercenary operation to an international conspiracy: James Morrison, a senior intelligence officer from a NATO country carrying diplomatic credentials. President Traoré arrived by helicopter at 7:00 a.m., just as the sun was rising over the Sahel. His calm demeanor masked controlled fury as he walked among the captured vehicles, examining weapons, reading documents, and looking into the faces of the men who had come to destroy his country. He stopped before Vandenberg, who sat on the ground with hands zip-tied behind his back, his UN credentials scattered in the dust beside him. "Colonel," the president said quietly, "you came to my country under the flag of peace while carrying weapons of war. You wore the blue helmet while planning to spill blood. Do you understand what you've done?" Vandenberg, maintaining his arrogance even in captivity, replied, "You have no idea what forces are behind this operation. Powers far greater than your small nation support our mission. You should have let us pass. Now you'll face consequences you can't imagine." Traoré knelt to Vandenberg's eye level. "Colonel, I believe you're the one who doesn't understand. You thought you could use the UN's reputation to shield your crimes. You believed my country was too weak, too poor, too afraid to stop you. You were wrong on all counts." The president stood and addressed all the captured mercenaries. "Gentlemen, you are now prisoners of war. Though war was never declared, you came armed and with intent to commit violence against a sovereign state. You will be treated according to international law, given fair trials, and the world will witness every moment of these proceedings. Your employers hiding behind corporate veils and diplomatic immunity will be exposed. The age of using Africa as your private battlefield is ending." The international response was immediate and chaotic. When the UN Secretary-General was awakened with news of captured UN personnel, his initial reaction was to demand their immediate release. However, when Burkina Faso began releasing video evidence of the weapons and documents found in the vehicles, the narrative changed dramatically. The footage was damning. Rows of assault rifles laid out beside UN medical supplies, detailed assassination lists next to children's vaccines, explosive devices hidden among food aid. The abuse of humanitarian symbols was so blatant that even the UN was forced to launch an emergency investigation into how their credentials and vehicles had been compromised. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council held emergency sessions. Nations whose citizens were among the captured mercenaries demanded their release while simultaneously denying any knowledge of the operation. Other countries called for full transparency and investigation, recognizing that the incident threatened the credibility of legitimate humanitarian operations worldwide. Within hours, clips from Burkina Faso's evidence presentation were being shared across social media platforms. The sight of heavily armed mercenaries admitting they weren't aid workers but soldiers for hire went viral globally, generating outrage and support for the small African nation that had stood up to such deception. The African Union called an emergency summit. President Traoré flew to Addis Ababa carrying boxes of evidence that would reshape continental security policy. His speech to the assembled leaders was perhaps the most important of his presidency. "Fellow Africans," he began, "what we uncovered at our border was not merely an attack on Burkina Faso, but an assault on African sovereignty itself. These men came disguised as humanitarians, carrying weapons instead of medicine, plans for destruction instead of development. They believed we were too weak to stop them, too divided to respond, too dependent to resist. They were wrong," he continued, his voice rising with passion. "For too long, our continent has been the staging ground for other people's wars, the testing ground for other people's weapons, the burial ground for other people's mistakes. Today we say no more. The 260 mercenaries we captured represent thousands more who operate across our continent with impunity. This ends now." The summit concluded with unprecedented unity. Every African nation agreed to implement strict inspection protocols for all international missions, including UN operations. A continental database of known mercenaries was established, and most importantly, an African court for crimes against sovereignty was created, giving the continent its own mechanism for prosecuting such violations. Back in Burkina Faso, the investigation revealed layers of conspiracy that stretched across continents and into the highest levels of government and corporate power. The encrypted communications devices carried by Morrison contained a treasure trove of information about similar operations conducted worldwide. The mercenaries themselves began cooperating, each hoping for reduced sentences. Their testimonies revealed the casual brutality of the private military world. Marcus Thompson, a British mercenary, admitted to similar operations in 4 other African countries. "It was just business," he said during interrogation. "Governments needed changing. We changed them. Resources needed securing. We secured them. I never thought about the people living there." Didier Dubois, a French former intelligence officer, provided the most damaging information. His testimony revealed lists of African officials across multiple countries who had been compromised, bribed, or blackmailed into cooperation. The list included respected diplomats, celebrated generals, and public figures who had built reputations championing sovereignty while secretly enabling its violation. Financial forensics revealed the funding sources for the operation. Mining companies seeking access to gold and uranium deposits, oil corporations eyeing potential reserves, and agricultural conglomerates wanting land for industrial farming. Each had contributed to the $300 million war chest, viewing the investment as minimal compared to the projected profits from unrestricted resource extraction. The trials began 3 months after the border incident. Despite enormous international pressure to extradite the prisoners or hold proceedings in international courts, Burkina Faso insisted on trying the mercenaries in its own judicial system. The prosecution was led by Aminata Sawadogo, a brilliant young lawyer who had returned from Harvard Law School specifically to serve her country. Her opening statement became a defining moment in international legal history. "These men came to our country as wolves in sheep's clothing, carrying death dressed as aid," she declared. "They believed that because we are economically developing, we lack sophisticated justice systems. They thought that because we have fewer advanced weapons, we lack the will to defend ourselves. They assumed that because powerful nations backed them, we would bow before them. Today in this courtroom, we prove them wrong on every count." The evidence presented was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Satellite imagery showed the convoy's suspicious route through areas known for smuggling. Communication intercepts revealed discussions of the operation in planning phases. Financial records traced payments from shell companies to mercenary bank accounts across multiple jurisdictions. Most damaging were the mercenaries' own recorded words from planning sessions, revealing their contempt for African life and sovereignty. One recording, played in court, captured Vandenberg briefing his team. "Remember, these are not professional military forces we're facing. They're poorly trained, poorly equipped, easily confused. A show of force, some explosions in the capital, and the government will collapse within 48 hours. We've done this before, gentlemen. Africa is easy." The courtroom fell silent after the recording ended. Vandenberg, sitting in the defendant's box, showed shame for the first time since his capture. The arrogance that had sustained him through decades of such operations finally cracked when confronted with his own words in an African court of law. International media coverage was unprecedented. Every major news organization sent correspondents to Ouagadougou. The trials were live-streamed with simultaneous translation into dozens of languages. For the first time, the world was witnessing the machinery of modern economic colonialism, exposed in detail through legal proceedings. Rather than leaked documents or investigative journalism, the diplomatic pressure on Burkina Faso intensified as the trials progressed. Former colonial powers demanded the release of their nationals. Military contractors threatened lawsuits in international courts. Some countries hinted at economic sanctions if the proceedings continued. However, the global equation had shifted. Burkina Faso was not standing alone. China and Russia, seeing an opportunity to challenge Western influence, provided diplomatic support. Other African nations formed a protective coalition, threatening to nationalize assets of any country that sanctioned Burkina Faso over the trials. Most surprisingly, civil society organizations in Western countries, horrified by the revelations, began protesting against their own government's pressure tactics. Anti-war activists, human rights groups, and religious organizations rallied to support Burkina Faso's right to prosecute those who had planned violence against its people. The verdicts, when they came, were comprehensive and uncompromising. All 260 mercenaries were found guilty of crimes against sovereignty, conspiracy to commit murder, and violations of international humanitarian law. Vandenberg and other operational leaders received life sentences. Rank-and-file mercenaries received 25-year terms. Morrison, the intelligence officer whose presence had elevated the incident to the level of state conspiracy, was sentenced to 30 years. The judge noted that his betrayal of diplomatic trust and involvement in planning violence against civilians warranted the harshest punishment short of life imprisonment. But the legal proceedings didn't end with the mercenaries. Burkina Faso filed charges in the International Criminal Court against the corporations and individuals who had funded the operation. Arrest warrants were issued for corporate executives who had planned the operation from comfortable boardrooms. Assets of companies involved in the conspiracy were frozen across multiple jurisdictions. The corporate response was predictable but ineffective: denial, legal challenges, claims of immunity. However, the evidence was too comprehensive, the documentation too complete, and the testimony too detailed to dismiss. Stock prices of implicated companies plummeted. Executives resigned en masse. Some fled to non-extradition countries, becoming international fugitives. The companies that had invested $300 million attempting to overthrow a government lost billions in market value, legal costs, and frozen assets. The private military industry, which had operated in shadows for decades, was forced into harsh light and public scrutiny. Insurance companies stopped covering mercenary operations after paying massive settlements. Banks refused to process payments that might be linked to such activities. Countries that had previously ignored mercenary recruitment began enforcing existing laws and passing new ones specifically targeting the industry. Robert Harrison, CEO of Titan Mining Corporation, testified during corporate proceedings that such operations were standard industry practice for difficult markets. When asked about human costs, he replied, "That wasn't my department. I focused on shareholder value." The statement, cold in its honesty, became a rallying cry for corporate reform movements worldwide. The conviction of corporate executives sent shockwaves through boardrooms globally. For the first time, CEOs were being held personally liable for crimes committed in pursuit of profit. The corporate veil that had traditionally protected executives from consequences was pierced decisively. International law evolved rapidly in response to the incident. The Rome Statute was amended to explicitly include corporate crimes against sovereignty. The UN created new verification agencies for humanitarian operations. Regional organizations strengthened their oversight mechanisms and intelligence sharing. The psychological impact was perhaps most significant. African nations, seeing that successful resistance was possible, gained confidence to challenge exploitative relationships. Border inspections became stricter across the continent. Intelligence services began cooperating to identify external threats, rather than focusing solely on internal dissent. Education curricula across Africa were updated to include the border incident as a case study in sovereignty defense. Children learned about Captain Moussa's vigilance, President Traoré's leadership, and Prosecutor Sawadogo's brilliant legal strategy. The story became part of continental consciousness, a modern tale of successful resistance to neo-colonial exploitation. The mercenaries serving sentences in Burkina Faso's prisons experienced a different Africa than they had imagined. They weren't mistreated. President Traoré insisted on humane conditions, but they lived as African prisoners lived, with basic accommodations and required labor. Some maintained their arrogance and racial superiority attitudes, but others began reflecting on their crimes. Thompson, the British mercenary, started teaching English to fellow prisoners and writing letters of apology to families affected by his previous operations. Dubois began cooperating fully with ongoing investigations, revealing more about the networks that had employed him across multiple countries. Even Vandenberg, broken by the complete collapse of his worldview, began writing what would become a memoir titled The Soldier Who Lost His Way. His writings, initially defiant, gradually showed recognition of the humanity he had systematically denied in his victims. The border guards who had participated in stopping the convoy became national heroes. Captain Moussa was promoted to major and given command of a new elite border protection unit. In interviews, he remained humble. "I was just doing my duty. Any of our soldiers would have done the same. We proved that African forces are professional, capable, and committed to defending our sovereignty." The incident inspired cultural productions across multiple media. The Night at the Border, a film by renowned Senegalese director Ousmane Sembène Jr., won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. The film's haunting portrayal of ordinary soldiers making extraordinary moral choices resonated with audiences worldwide. 260 Wolves, a novel by Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, became an international bestseller, exploring themes of sovereignty, dignity, and resistance through interconnected narratives of mercenaries, guards, and civilians. Academic studies analyzed every aspect of the incident from multiple perspectives. Military strategists examined the tactical lessons of the border confrontation, particularly how inferior numbers and equipment could triumph through superior positioning and moral authority. Legal scholars studied the trial proceedings and their unprecedented impact on international law, especially the establishment of corporate criminal liability for sovereignty violations. Economists calculated the costs of corruption versus transparency in resource management, demonstrating that ethical governance generated higher long-term returns than exploitative practices. Psychologists explored the mindset that enabled educated, otherwise ordinary individuals to plan mass atrocities for financial gain. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's groundbreaking study, The Banality of Corporate Evil, examined how business structures and incentives could systematically suppress moral reasoning among executives and operatives. The incident became one of the most studied events in modern African history, generating thousands of research papers, doctoral dissertations, and policy analyses. Universities worldwide established courses examining the case from various disciplinary perspectives, from business ethics to international relations, from military strategy to developmental economics. 5 years into their sentences, an unprecedented rehabilitation program was established at the prison facility. Dr. Aminata Kone, a psychologist who had studied radicalization and de-radicalization processes, designed a comprehensive program aimed at addressing the systematic dehumanization that had enabled the mercenaries' crimes. The program began with education about African history, challenging the colonial narratives that had justified their worldview. Mercenaries attended lectures by African historians, philosophers, and community leaders. They participated in cultural exchange programs with local communities, learning traditional crafts and contributing to development projects. Marcus Thompson, the British mercenary who had initially been defiant, underwent a remarkable transformation. He began teaching English literacy classes to fellow prisoners and local community members. His letters home described a growing understanding of the humanity he had been trained to ignore. "I spent 20 years seeing Africans as problems to be solved rather than people with their own aspirations and dignity," he wrote to his sister. "Working alongside them, learning from them, I understand how thoroughly I had been brainwashed by an industry that profits from reducing complex human beings to strategic objectives." Not all mercenaries responded positively to rehabilitation efforts. Vandenberg and several others maintained their supremacist attitudes, writing manifestos about racial hierarchies and the supposed right of advanced civilizations to control global resources. These writings, when leaked to international media, further damaged any remaining sympathy for the mercenaries' cause and revealed the ideological poison that motivated such operations. The resources that would have been extracted under the planned puppet regime remained in Burkina Faso, generating revenue that funded dramatic improvements in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. The transparent bidding processes implemented by President Traoré attracted legitimate international investment while ensuring fair returns to the nation and its people. The Ouagadougou Institute of Technology, built with mining revenues that had been protected from foreign theft, became a regional center of excellence. Students from across West Africa came to study engineering, computer science, and sustainable development. The Institute's research programs focused on appropriate technology for African conditions, generating innovations that were exported globally. Dr. Fatima Zarome, who had led the reverse engineering of the Mercenaries' communication equipment, established a technology company that specialized in secure communications for developing nations. Her innovations in low-cost, tamper-resistant systems were adopted by governments and NGOs worldwide, generating significant export revenues for the country. The agricultural sector, freed from the threat of displacement by mining operations, flourished under new cooperative structures. Farmers' collectives used modern irrigation techniques and crop rotation methods to increase yields while maintaining soil health. The surplus production was processed locally, creating value-added exports that commanded premium prices in international markets. The investigation into Morrison's encrypted communications revealed a vast network of compromised officials, journalists, and academics across multiple African countries. The database contained detailed profiles of individuals who had been recruited, bribed, or blackmailed into serving foreign interests while maintaining public personas as African patriots. President Traoré made the difficult decision to release this information publicly, despite the diplomatic chaos it would cause. The revelations led to resignations, prosecutions, and political upheavals across the continent as African publics learned which of their leaders had been secretly working for foreign corporations and intelligence agencies. Dr. Samuel Wangi, a Kenyan psychologist who analyzed the psychological profiles, testified before the African Union about their implications. These documents reveal a level of systematic manipulation that goes beyond traditional espionage, he explained. Foreign actors studied African leaders like laboratory specimens, identifying personal weaknesses and cultural pressure points that could be exploited for geopolitical advantage. The exposure of these networks led to massive reforms in African intelligence services. Previously focused on monitoring internal dissent, they pivoted toward identifying and countering foreign infiltration. The African Intelligence Cooperation Network, established in response to these revelations, became one of the world's most effective counterintelligence organizations. The legal precedents established by the Burkina Faso trials influenced international law development for decades. The concept of sovereignty crimes, actions taken specifically to violate national sovereignty, became established in international criminal law. The Ouagadougou principles required transparency in all international operations, whether military, humanitarian, or commercial. The International Criminal Court expanded its jurisdiction to include corporate executives who planned or funded operations against sovereign states. The Rome Statute was amended to close loopholes that had allowed corporate actors to escape prosecution for international crimes. The United Nations underwent significant reforms after the revelation of how easily its credentials had been compromised. The new verification protocols required multiple levels of authentication for humanitarian operations, with oversight from both sending and receiving governments. The Blue Helmet, tarnished by its association with the mercenary operation, slowly regained credibility through reformed practices and genuine transparency. Regional organizations worldwide strengthened their own oversight mechanisms. The African Union created a rapid response capability to assist member states facing sovereignty threats. Similar protocols were adopted by ASEAN, the Arab League, and other regional bodies, creating a global network of mutual sovereignty protection. The trials of corporate executives began 2 years after the mercenary convictions. These proceedings, held partly in Burkina Faso and partly at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, exposed the systematic nature of corporate involvement in sovereignty violations. Robert Harrison, CEO of Titan Mining Corporation, became the face of corporate criminality when his emails discussing the operation were read in court. His casual references to removing obstacles, to resource access, and implementing final solutions for uncooperative governments revealed the euphemistic language that allowed executives to distance themselves psychologically from the violence they ordered. The financial records presented during the trials showed the operation's funding structure in devastating detail. Shell companies registered in tax havens had channeled money from major corporations through multiple layers of intermediaries before reaching the mercenary operators. The paper trail, painstakingly reconstructed by international investigators, demonstrated how legitimate businesses had knowingly funded illegal military operations. Sandra Williams, the former chief financial officer of Continental Resources Ltd., provided the most damaging testimony when she agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Her detailed account of board meetings where assassination lists were discussed like quarterly budgets, shocked, even cynical. Observers of corporate behavior, these weren't rogue operations, she testified. They were planned and approved at the highest corporate levels. The board reviewed target lists, approved budgets for weapons purchases, and discussed post-operation resource extraction plans. They talked about overthrowing governments, the way they might discuss opening new retail locations. Environmental. Scientists calculated the ecological disaster that had been prevented by stopping the mercenary operation. The planned mining operations would have poisoned water sources serving 10 million people across 3 river basins. Over 500,000 hectares of arable land would have been rendered uninhabitable by toxic runoff. Dr. Marie Ouedraogo, an environmental engineer who studied the proposed mining sites, published research showing that the ecological damage would have been irreversible. The mercury and cyanide-based extraction methods they planned to use would have created dead zones lasting centuries, her report concluded. Entire ecosystems would have been obliterated for short-term profit. The areas marked for destructive exploitation were instead designated as protected ecological reserves. Local communities became guardians of these preserved lands, developing ecotourism and sustainable harvesting programs that generated income while protecting biodiversity. The economic value of these conservation efforts, calculated over decades, exceeded the short-term profits that would have been extracted through mining. Climate scientists noted that the preserved forests continued serving as carbon sinks, contributing to global climate stability. The trees that would have been clear-cut for mining access remained standing, sequestering millions of tons of carbon dioxide that would otherwise have contributed to global warming. The families of captured mercenaries faced their own crises as the full extent of their relatives' intended crimes became public. Some stood by their imprisoned family members, visiting regularly and maintaining relationships across prison walls. Others, learning the details of planned atrocities, severed connections entirely. Sarah Vandenberg, the colonel's daughter, became an unexpected voice for reconciliation and accountability. She traveled to Burkina Faso, met with families who would have been affected by her father's operation, and publicly apologized for his planned crimes. Her book, My Father's Sins, Growing Up with a War Criminal, explored how ordinary families could produce individuals capable of extraordinary evil. The psychological impact on mercenary families was profound. Children discovered that fathers they had admired as heroes were actually war criminals. Spouses learned that their comfortable lifestyles had been funded by blood money from operations across multiple continents. Support groups formed in various countries to help these families process their complex emotions and begin healing from the trauma of such revelations. Jennifer Morrison, wife of the imprisoned intelligence officer, took a different path entirely. She divorced her husband, liquidated their assets, and used the proceeds to establish a foundation supporting victims of mercenary operations worldwide. Her organization provided legal assistance, medical care, and educational opportunities for communities affected by private military violence. The sophisticated equipment captured from the mercenaries provided an unexpected technological boost to Burkina Faso's development. The communication systems, surveillance equipment, and military hardware intended for destruction were instead repurposed for constructive purposes. The satellite communication systems became the backbone of a national internet infrastructure, connecting rural communities to global information networks for the first time. The surveillance equipment was adapted for agricultural monitoring, helping farmers optimize crop yields and detect pest infestations early. Dr. Ibrahim Sawadogo, leading the Technology Adaptation Project, described the irony of the situation. Equipment brought to destroy our sovereignty instead strengthened our capacity for independent development. Tools designed for oppression became instruments of liberation. The weapons seized from the mercenaries were ceremonially destroyed and recycled into agricultural implements and construction materials. The metal from assault rifles became plowshares and school desks. The explosives were used for beneficial construction projects like road building and well drilling. Most significantly, the reverse engineering of the mercenaries' advanced technology created a domestic technical capability that had not existed before. Burkina Faso began manufacturing its own communications equipment, exporting secure systems to other African nations and competing successfully with established international suppliers. The incident prompted comprehensive reforms in educational curricula both within Burkina Faso and across Africa. The story of the convoy became a case study in sovereignty defense, taught alongside traditional independence movements as examples of successful resistance to foreign domination. Primary school students learned about Captain Moussa's vigilance and courage through age-appropriate stories that emphasized the importance of doing one's duty, regardless of pressure from powerful people. Secondary students studied the legal proceedings and their implications for international law. University students analyzed the economic, political, and social dimensions of the incident from multiple academic perspectives. International educational institutions also incorporated the case into their curricula. Business schools taught it as a case study in corporate criminality and the importance of ethical decision-making. Military academies used it to discuss the distinction between legitimate military service and mercenary activity. Law schools analyzed the trial's procedural innovations and their impact on international jurisprudence. The Captain Moussa Leadership Academy, established at the border site, became a premier training facility for customs and border security personnel from across Africa and beyond. Students learned not just technical skills but the moral principles that enabled effective sovereignty defense, integrity, courage, and commitment to justice over personal advantage. 50 years after the incident, the world had fundamentally changed. The casual assumption that powerful nations or corporations could overthrow governments with impunity was relegated to history books. The belief that African resources were available for taking was understood as antiquated thinking. The idea that sovereignty was negotiable based on economic or military power was recognized as dangerous delusion. The memorial at the border crossing had expanded into a complex that included a museum, research center, and peace institute. Scholars from around the world came to study the incident and its implications. The site where sovereignty had been successfully defended became a place where sovereignty was continuously taught, practiced, and renewed. General Moussa, in his final interview before passing at age 89, reflected on the night that changed everything. "We were just border guards doing our job. We had no idea that stopping those vehicles would reshape international relations. But perhaps that's the lesson. Sovereignty is defended not through grand gestures, but through ordinary people doing their duty with extraordinary courage." The white vehicles of the convoy, preserved in the museum, served as silent witnesses to the power of vigilance and moral courage. School children walking through them could see exactly where weapons had been hidden among medical supplies, understanding viscerally the deception that had been attempted and the importance of the resistance that had succeeded. The inscription on the memorial's central monument captured the incident's enduring significance. "Here 260 men came to steal our sovereignty. Here we proved that sovereignty cannot be purchased, cannot be surrendered, and cannot be destroyed by those who mistake our hospitality for weakness. It can only be defended by each generation with the same vigilance our ancestors showed this dawn." The convoy that had approached in darkness, carrying weapons disguised as aid and death disguised as development, had been stopped by something more powerful than superior firepower or international pressure. It had been stopped by the awakened consciousness of a people who refused to be colonized again in any form, by any means, for any price. In the end, the 260 mercenaries who believed they were writing Africa's continued subjugation instead wrote its definitive liberation. They came as wolves expecting to find sheep, but discovered lions. The world that watched this transformation understood that its fundamental assumptions about power, sovereignty, and justice needed complete reconsideration. The dawn that broke over the Sahel that morning illuminated not just the landscape, but a new era of global relations based on mutual respect rather than exploitation, partnership rather than domination, and justice rather than might. The convoy had been stopped, but the principles it represented continued to guide nations worldwide in defending their sovereignty and dignity against all threats, foreign and domestic, corporate and governmental, obvious and disguised. This was the ultimate legacy of that pre-dawn confrontation at a remote border post. Proof that with sufficient courage and principle, any nation could defend its sovereignty against any threat, no matter how well-funded, well-equipped, or well-connected the attackers might be. 25 years after the convoy incident, a new generation of Burkina Faso had grown up in a transformed nation. These young people, born into sovereignty that their parents' generation had fought to defend, carried themselves with a confidence that impressed international observers. Aminata Traoré Jr., named after the prosecutor who had led the mercenary trials, represented this new generation. At age 23, she had completed her engineering degree at the Ouagadougou Institute of Technology and was leading a team developing solar energy systems for rural communities. Her innovations in low-cost renewable energy had attracted international attention and investment partnerships with European and Asian companies, partnerships negotiated as equals rather than dependency, relationships. My parents' generation had to prove we could defend ourselves, she explained, to a delegation of international students. My generation gets to prove what we can build when we're not under attack. We're not just surviving foreign interference, we're thriving because we prevented it. The psychological transformation was profound. These young Burkina Faso pursued education, innovation, and entrepreneurship with the assumption that their efforts would benefit their own nation rather than foreign exploiters. The fear that had constrained previous generations, the constant anxiety that foreign powers might intervene to steal their progress, had been replaced by confidence in their nation's ability to protect its achievements. Dr. Samuel Caboret, a sociologist studying generational changes, documented this shift in his research. The convoy generation, as we call them, approaches life with fundamentally different assumptions than their parents, he wrote. They expect justice, demand transparency, and assume their sovereignty. What previous generations had to fight for, they consider birthright. The success of Burkina Faso's sovereignty defense inspired similar transformations across West Africa. Mali, Niger, and Ghana implemented their own versions of the Moussa protocols, comprehensive border inspection procedures that treated no foreign entity as above scrutiny. The economic integration that followed was unprecedented. The West African Economic Union, previously hindered by member states' fears of exploitation, became a powerful regional bloc as nations gained confidence that their neighbors wouldn't be used as staging grounds for foreign interference. President Kwame Asante of Ghana, speaking at the regional summit marking the 25th anniversary of the convoy incident, captured this transformation. Brother Traoré's courage at the border didn't just save Burkina Faso, it liberated all of us from the assumption that we were powerless against foreign manipulation. Today we negotiate as equals, because we know we can defend ourselves as equals. The regional intelligence sharing network had prevented dozens of attempted sovereignty violations. Corporate attempts to bribe officials were immediately exposed and prosecuted. Mercenary recruitment efforts were identified and disrupted before they could gain momentum. The network effect of continental sovereignty defense created an environment where such operations became exponentially more difficult and risky. The economic benefits were quantifiable. The West African region's GDP had grown by 400% in the 25 years following the convoy incident, driven by retention of resource revenues, transparent governance, and genuine international partnerships rather than exploitative extraction relationships. By the 2040s, sovereignty threats had evolved beyond physical mercenaries to digital warfare. Corporate and state actors attempted to achieve through cyber operations what the convoy mercenaries had failed to accomplish through violence. The Cyber Sovereignty Institute, established in Ouagadougou, became Africa's premier center for digital defense. Dr. Fatima Zorome, now in her 60s and leading the institute, applied the same principles that had guided the convoy investigation to cyber threats. The mercenaries came with weapons hidden among medical supplies, she explained, to a conference of international cybersecurity experts. Today's threats come as helpful technology updates that contain surveillance malware, as social media platforms that manipulate political discourse, as economic data services that extract financial intelligence. The principle remains the same. Verify everything, trust nothing at face value, and maintain the courage to say no to powerful actors. The Institute developed revolutionary techniques for detecting and countering cyber infiltration. Their innovations in quantum encryption and decentralized communication networks were exported globally, generating significant revenue while protecting democratic institutions worldwide. The irony wasn't lost on observers. The nation that mercenaries had targeted as technologically backward was now leading global innovation in digital sovereignty. Protectio, the corporate world had been forced to evolve, dramatically in response to the legal precedents established by the convoy trials. The era of corporate impunity had ended, replaced by unprecedented transparency requirements and personal accountability for executives. Marcus Chen, who had become CEO of a reformed mining company, exemplified this new corporate leadership. His company operated under the Ouagadougou principles: complete transparency in operations, environmental protection that exceeded international standards, and profit-sharing agreements with local communities. The old model was unsustainable, Chen explained to Harvard Business School students studying the case. Companies that tried to maximize short-term extraction through corruption and violence ultimately destroyed more value than they created. The new model, genuine partnership with sovereign nations, generates higher returns precisely because it's built on trust and mutual benefit. His company's operations in Burkina Faso generated employment for thousands of local workers, funded environmental restoration projects, and contributed to community development through contractually obligated profit sharing. The transparency requirements meant that every financial transaction was publicly auditable, every environmental impact was monitored independently, and every community benefit was legally enforceable. The contrast with the old extractive model was stark. Where previous mining operations had left behind poisoned landscapes and impoverished communities, the new partnerships created sustained prosperity and environmental protection. The private military industry that had once operated with virtual impunity had largely collapsed by the 2040s. The combination of legal prosecutions, insurance exclusions, and reputational damage had made mercenary operations economically unsustainable for most corporations. Derek Thompson, the former British mercenary who had served 25 years in Burkina Faso before being released, had become an unexpected advocate against military privatization. His memoir, The Fools, Gold of War, exposed the industry's systematic exploitation of veterans and its manipulation of corporate clients. They promised us million-dollar payouts for what they described as simple security work, Thompson wrote. They never mentioned that we'd be planning mass murder, overthrowing elected governments, and destroying entire communities. They certainly never mentioned that we'd spend decades in African prisons, abandoned by the corporations that had recruited us. His testimony before parliamentary committees in multiple countries led to stricter regulations on private military companies. Several nations banned their citizens from participating in mercenary operations entirely, making recruitment significantly more difficult. The few remaining private military companies operated under strict international oversight, providing legitimate security services rather than conducting covert operations. The age of corporate armies operating in legal shadows had ended. The global balance of power had shifted fundamentally. The assumption that Western nations could unilaterally intervene in developing countries had been replaced by multipolar diplomacy requiring genuine consensus and respect for sovereignty. United Nations had been reformed extensively, with enhanced representation for African, Asian, and Latin American nations. The Security Council had been expanded to include permanent representation from each continent, ending the post-colonial arrangement that had concentrated power among former imperial nations. Dr. Sarah Williams, who had served as Burkina Faso's ambassador to the UN during the crucial reform period, reflected on these changes. The convoy incident proved that sovereignty isn't negotiable and that justice has no expiration date. These principles became the foundation for a new international order based on equality rather than hierarchy. The reforms extended beyond formal structures to operational practices. Humanitarian interventions required explicit consent from affected populations, verified through independent monitoring. Economic agreements included enforceable provisions for environmental protection and community benefit. Military cooperation was conducted between equals, rather than through patron-client relationships. The conservation of areas that would have been destroyed by mining operations had positioned Burkina Faso as a global leader in environmental protection. The preserved ecosystems had become living laboratories for climate adaptation and biodiversity conservation. The Sahel Conservation Initiative, headquartered in Ouagadougou, coordinated environmental protection efforts across the region. Their innovations in desert reclamation, drought-resistant agriculture, and renewable energy had global applications, particularly for regions facing climate change challenges. Dr. Marie Ouedraogo, now in her 70s and leading the Conservation Initiative, had become one of the world's most respected environmental scientists. Her research on ecosystem restoration in arid lands was being applied from the Middle East to the American Southwest. The mercenaries came to extract our resources and destroy our environment for short-term profits, she observed. By stopping them, we preserved ecosystems that are now helping the world adapt to climate change. Our resistance to exploitation became leadership in conservation. The economic value of this environmental leadership was substantial. Carbon credit sales, ecotourism revenue, and licensing of conservation technologies generated billions in income while maintaining ecological integrity. Legal precedents established by the convoy trials had evolved into a comprehensive system of international justice. The International Court of Corporate Accountability, established in Ouagadougou, had jurisdiction over corporate crimes against sovereignty worldwide. Judge Aminata Sawadogo, now Chief Justice of the court, oversaw proceedings that had fundamentally changed corporate behavior globally. Her court had prosecuted executives from multiple continents for operations similar to what had been attempted. In Burkina Faso, justice delayed is justice denied, she said in her landmark judgment against executives who had planned regime change operations in 3 African countries. But justice achieved becomes justice assured. Every corporate executive now knows that sovereignty violations will be prosecuted regardless of their nationality, their connections, or their claimed immunity. The court's reach extended beyond individual prosecutions to structural reforms. Corporations operating internationally were required to maintain transparent operations, respect local sovereignty, and contribute to community development. Failure to comply resulted in asset freezes, trade restrictions, and executive prosecutions. 60 years after Captain Moussa stopped the convoy at the border, the world order had been fundamentally transformed. The casual assumption that powerful actors could violate sovereignty with impunity had been replaced by systems ensuring accountability for all international actors. The memorial at the border crossing had become one of Africa's most visited sites, but it wasn't simply a monument to past victory. It was a working center for ongoing sovereignty defense, where new generations learned the principles and practices necessary to maintain their freedom. Fatima Moussa, Captain Moussa's granddaughter and current director of the Memorial Center, often addressed visiting delegations. My grandfather didn't know he was changing world history when he decided to search those vehicles. He was just doing his job with integrity and courage. That's the lesson we teach here. World-changing moments come from ordinary people doing their duty extraordinarily well. The white convoy vehicles, now 60 years old, remained on display as silent witnesses to the power of vigilance and moral courage. But the real testament to that night's significance wasn't found in any museum. It was found in the confidence of young Africans pursuing their dreams without fear of foreign interference, in the partnerships between nations built on mutual respect rather than exploitation, and in the international systems ensuring that justice reached across all borders. The convoy that had approached in darkness, carrying weapons disguised as aid and death disguised as development, had been stopped by something more powerful than superior numbers or international pressure. It had been stopped by the awakened consciousness of people who refused to accept that their sovereignty was negotiable, their resources were available for theft, or their dignity was subject to foreign approval. The 260 mercenaries had come believing they were writing another chapter in Africa's subjugation. Instead, they became footnotes in the story of global transformation, the story of how one moment of courage and principle at a remote border post proved that sovereignty could be defended. Justice could be achieved, and dignity could triumph over any threat, regardless of its source, sophistication, or support. The dawn that broke over the Sahel on that morning 60 years earlier had never ended. It continued to illuminate a world where sovereignty was respected, justice was universal, and the courage of ordinary people serving their nations with integrity remained the ultimate defense against all forms of exploitation and oppression. 25 years after the incident, a memorial was erected at the border crossing where the convoy was stopped. The inscription read, "Here on this ground, 260 men came to steal our sovereignty. Here on this ground, we prove that sovereignty cannot be bought, sold, or surrendered. It must be defended by each generation." The memorial became a pilgrimage site for African military officers studying sovereignty defense. The border post was converted into a training center where officers from across the continent learned detection techniques, inspection protocols, and most importantly, the courage to confront powerful forces attempting to violate national sovereignty. Captain Moussa. Now, General Moussa, in his retirement, often spoke to visiting delegations. "Sovereignty requires eternal vigilance," he would say. "Every border guard, every customs officer, every soldier must understand that our independence depends on their courage to say no to those who would exploit us, regardless of their credentials or claimed authority." The convoy of white vehicles that approached the border at 3:47 a.m. had intended to write one story, the story of Africa's continued subjugation. Instead, they became characters in a different narrative entirely, the story of a continent that refused to be colonized again, in any form, by any means, for any price. The 260 mercenaries who believed they were bringing civilization to a backward continent discovered instead a sophisticated society with functioning institutions, professional military forces, and uncompromising commitment to justice. They came expecting weakness and found strength. They planned exploitation and encountered resistance. They brought chaos and were met with order. In the end, their failed operation became a symbol of Africa's emergence as a continent of sovereign nations capable of defending their independence, prosecuting their enemies, and writing their own future. The dawn that broke over the Sahel on that morning illuminated not just the landscape, but a new era of African self-determination that would reshape global power dynamics for generations to come. The white vehicles with their false UN markings remained in a museum, silent testimony to the price of underestimating African resolve and the power of sovereign nations to defend their dignity against any threat, regardless of its source or sophistication.